So once you have your micro chamber archival paper, you want to get your backing board. Now, if your backing board comes in and it's a little warped, like one side bubbles out a little bit, like this side here is bubbling outwards, concave. And you want to have your comic on the side that's bubbling out and not, actually I said concave, actually convex. You want your comic on the side that's bubbling out, and very soon it will actually flatten in your box. But you don't want to put your comic in where the backing board is sort of like a valley and it's dipping in the middle. You'd rather have it on top of the hump. And you know, if it's really radically bent, then your boards, then you should lay them flat for a week or two until they really flatten out. If it's just slightly bubbling, you can go ahead and start packing, and it won't damage your comic as long as it's not too much of a bend. Okay, then you get your 4 mil paper and bag rather. Now the important thing to do when you bag your comic is you should get the paper with a flap. This has an 1.5-inch flap on top that you can fold over. Now if you go with the archival paper, that's fine, but if you do that, it's going to be open on top. So if there's a flood or a fire and the sprinklers come on, it increases the chance of water coming down into your comic. The one exception would be is if you get the 4 mil archival paper and you put your comic in a 1 or 2 mil bag first and then put it in the 4 mil bag. But again, to save on cost and do the job just as effectively with one sheet, you're going to want to get the 4 mil archival paper with a flap on top. And for Golden Age comics, it's kind of hard to find. It's much more common for Silver Age and smaller sizes. So the important thing with this is when you put your comic in there, you have to be really careful that the lower end of the flap doesn't abrase your comic and cause abrasion. So when you put your comic up against the backing board, you want to leave a little space around the edges of the board so it's not totally jammed up against any one side. If there's any additional space at all that's minimized, in other words, the least amount of space you can keep at top, because once we bag it, it's going to kind of bubble over there a little bit. So once you have your comic centered, what you want to do is flip the bag over so the long end of the flap is on top so you can see what you're doing. Now you start by putting one corner of the board into the lower end of the bag so that you can cleanly watch the corners as you slide this baby in. Now once you have the board in, it's really important to roll this long flap all the way back, otherwise you can have it catch on the spine or any part of your comic and tear. So once the end is cleanly rolled back, you just slide your comic in. By the way, this is a great opportunity as you're sliding in. If your comic has any imperfections, like a piece that might be ruffled, now is the time to correct that by sliding it in flat, and over time you can actually improve upon the condition of a damaged comic with Mylar if you put it in there flat. You might want to use a toothpick, for example, if there's a corner or edge which is perforated. As you're sliding it in, you can use a toothpick and flatten that out, and over time it'll actually stick that way and actually increase the quality of your comic. That's what's so cool about Mylar. Okay, so now see how easily it slides in? Now you don't need to shove it all the way to the bottom, because these Mylar bags are so stiff, it'll actually prevent the board from going cleanly to the bottom. However, you need to make sure it's straight. And even though the comic sticks like a millimeter or 2 or 3 above the top, that's okay, because once we roll over the top, it kind of bubbles up there and keeps it preserved without being too tight. I guess what I'm trying to say is you don't want to have to shove your comic in where it's so tight that you're going to flatten the corners. You know, if you want to have the higher graded comic, you need to keep the corners as stiff and intact as possible. Okay, next step, take some Scotch tape. Because these are 4mm bags, you'll actually want 2 pieces instead of 1. And the best thing to do is to apply 1 at each side, coming inwards like a V. And therefore it keeps the top nice and trim. Now, even though the very top of this comic is actually above, slightly above the level of the board or equal to it, when you tape it down, the Mylar is so thick it'll naturally kind of bubble up on top, and it's okay. It doesn't create any pressure at all, and it still keeps the overall book firm. Now the bottom is plenty stiff, but it's not jamming the corners in. See, this corner is still square, albeit it's a 60-year-old book. It's already a little flattened, but the point is, by having this slight buffer against the bottom, you're not going to flatten the whole entire bottom. And the same goes for the sides, and especially the spine. If you actually squeeze the spine too much, there's a danger of creating spine roll. This comic has slight spine roll, but it's not that bad. So here we have The Man Who Laughs. Now the final step is you can take your labels here, and this is a classic illustrated comic. It's issue 71, and Classics Illustrated, they have an interesting system of keeping track of their comics, because they've had a lot of reissues, and they use something called an HRN, which is highest reference number. Anyway, to cut to the chase, when it comes to labeling Classics Illustrated, you not only have to give the comic number, but you should give the HRN number. This is an original edition, the 10-cent edition, and so it's Comic 71, HRN 71. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is on one of my labels, write 71, parentheses, HRN 71. And the grade for this, I'll say, is very good. I'll say VG plus. You know, that's still being conservative. I mean, this is a pretty nice book. Take my label off. Anyway, I'm just going to stick it on the back. And when I put future labels on, I'll try to put them in the same area for this line of comics, so that when I'm thumbing through my box, they'll all be, you know, in the same position. Okay, so now I'm going to show you what happens when you try to bag a comic in a Mylar bag that's too small. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people order these Mylar bags in the Silver Age edition because they're the most common to find, and they end up being a little too small. But because they already ordered them, they end up shoving their comics into the bag. And honestly, you're torturing your comic, and I'll show you what I mean. This is actually a Silver Age Mylar bag. The backing board is Silver Age 2, so it's going to fit in there tightly. And I'm using another Classics Illustrated. This one's a little lower grade for the example, Julius Caesar. This is probably a good minus. Now, even though it fits squarely on the backing board like my Victor Hugo comic, watch the difference when I try to squeeze it into this bag. Okay, first I'm going to start with the corners. Okay, the comic is about as well centered on this backing board as I can get. Now, putting in the corners in itself is kind of tight, and it's already folding the corner over a little bit. That's the danger about having a bag that's too tight. Okay, so I'm going to go with the second corner. Now I have the thing fully rolled over. Now it slides in pretty good. It's kind of flattening down, but it's really tight. Now when it gets to the end, I got to really shove it in there. Okay, now it looks okay, you know, it looks okay. But the problem is, in reality, it's super tight, and you know that when you try to pull it out. It's really hard. I'm really pulling this thing. It barely comes out, and if you look at the corners, they're really scrunched in there. Okay, wait a second. See, I can't even pull it out, and that's pretty scary. You know, if you find yourself doing this with your comics, your Mylar's too tight, and you need to get a bigger Mylar. You could go with a smaller backing board, like a half back, but the bottom line is your Mylar is too small. Again, when you go with 4mm Mylar, your comic is not going to swim around, because 4mm is so thick. Okay, let's give another example. Another Classics Illustrated, beautiful edition, Golden Age, number 57, 1949. Okay, so you're talking a 64, almost 65-year-old book. Okay, so you're talking about a 64-year-old book. And again, I grade conservatively. I'll give this book a very good plus, mainly because the pages, while not brittle, they're starting to yellow. Okay, so I'm going to grab my archival paper. And again, I'm going to put one sheet in the front, and one sheet on the back cover. And grab my backing board. I'm going to center it. The least amount of space I'll go ahead and leave on top. It's actually about 1 millimeter below the top, while the bottom has a good 4 or 5 millimeters to spare. That's what I want. Now I'm going to make sure I grab my Golden Age bag this time. Now the flap, the 1/2-inch flap, is going to be on top so I can clearly see what I'm doing. You start with one of the corners, you make sure the corner doesn't bend, you stick the second corner in.